Jericho. Something was kicking Jotham in the behind, and he didn't like it much. He was still sound asleep and had every intention of staying that way. Jotham, get up! It was the second time Jotham had heard the voice, and this time he recognized it as that of Bartholomew. It's time for morning prayers, Bartholomew whispered as the other boys looked at him crossly for talking. Jotham opened one eye just enough to see, then mumbled, I don't feel like praying today. He had been awake very late thinking about what Nathan had said last night, and he only slept a few hours. You must go to morning prayers, Bartholomew pleaded. Everyone must go. But Jotham ignored Bartholomew. After a moment, a sly look crossed Bartholomew's face, and he said in a taunting voice, The rabbi will be most displeased if you are not at the morning prayers. Jotham's eyes shot open as he remembered the lesson the rabbi had taught Bartholomew the night before. In moments he was out of bed and dressed, not wanting his bottom to suffer the same fate. The prayers were said in a small synagogue by a garden. Then the morning meal was served. Bartholomew didn't utter a word during the teachings. Afterward, Jotham helped him to do his chores, which involved moving the big clay urns from the pottery building where they had been baked to a room where the scriptures were copied. The sun had moved an hour across the sky when the two boys, carrying the last of the urns out of the furnace room, they were walking to the scribe's room, with Bartholomew in the lead carrying the top of the urn and Jotham carrying the bottom. When Bartholomew suddenly slipped, the urn went crashing to the ground and broke into 1,000 pieces. Just then the rabbi came walking across the compound, and as the sound of the crash, turned to look. Bartholomew looked back and forth between the urn and the rabbi, his face looking like a cornered rabbit. Rabbi, he stuttered, forgive me, I slipped in the dirt and the urn just... The rabbi held up his hand and interrupted Bartholomew. He looked slowly from the broken pieces to the panic on the boy's face. Bartholomew, he said slowly, why are you so frightened? Is it because of the lesson you learned last night, you had to learn last night? Bartholomew nodded his head. The rabbi grasped the boy's shoulder and then said softly, Bartholomew, the punishment you received last night was for a willful breaking of the rules. This, he said, sweeping his hand over the shattered urn, was an accident. We do not punish men or boys for making mistakes, only for acting in disobedience. Bartholomew stopped quivering and even managed a little smile. Just then Nathan walked up. Jotham, it is time to leave, he said. Jotham looked at Bartholomew and suddenly wasn't so sure he really wanted to leave. But then he said, Yes, Nathan, I will gather my things. With Bartholomew's help, Jotham gathered his new clothes, a blanket the dormitory keeper had given him, and a new food bag. Just before they left the dormitory, Bartholomew handed Jotham a walking stick. Here, he said, I want you to have this. It is my favorite, and it would honor me if you would use it. Jotham stood there with his mouth open, the right words stuck somewhere behind his tongue. It's all right, Bartholomew said. I have another, and you should not be traveling without one. Jotham gave Bartholomew a long hug as he had seen his father do after successful business transactions. Then together they went and found Nathan. It was hard to walk out in the front gate, leaving Qumran behind. Jotham turned and gave the last wave to Bartholomew and hoped he would see him again some day. You are quiet this morning, Nathan said after a long while. I will miss Qumran, Jotham answered. Then a moment later he added, and Bartholomew. And after some time he asked, How far is it to Jericho? Less than half the distance we traveled to En-Gedi to Qumran, Nathan answered. Jotham was pleased with this, and it lifted his spirits. They stopped to eat their noon meal among the trees and reeds at a place where the Jordan River entered the Salt Sea. Jotham had never seen such a beautiful place and begged Nathan to let him swim in the river. No, we must continue on, Nathan said, if we are to reach Jericho by sundown. All afternoon Jotham kept quizzing Nathan about Jericho. Though it was the place of his birth, Jotham really didn't know much about it. Will there be camel tricks there, he asked. Perhaps, Nathan answered. What about snakes? I heard of a man who is the god of snakes and charms with them with a flute. Will he be there? Probably not. Finally, Nathan was exasperated with all the questions and stopped in the middle of the road. Jotham, he said sharply, you really must stop asking questions about Jericho. But Nathan, Jotham whined, why? Because, my friend, Nathan said, now smiling, we are there. And with that, Nathan pointed to the grove of palm trees that seemed to stick up out of the middle of the road. Beyond them, Jotham saw the city of his birth. Jericho was even more beautiful than Jotham had remembered. Trees thick with dates lined the streets. All the houses were made of reddish plaster, and the roofs were of brown tiles made of clay. Plants and shrubs made everything green. And everywhere Jotham looked, he saw a water well. What a rich and beautiful city, Jotham thought. This is where the Messiah should be born. Nathan led Jotham through through several streets. Soon they stopped at a doorway along a narrow street and knocked on the door. A man not much taller than Jotham, but very much older, came to the door, and seeing Nathan, broke into a huge grin. "Nathan, my friend," he yelled, embracing him, "I was just thinking of you this morning." "And why was that? Did you break yet another pot?" The man laughed loudly. "No such thing. I simply missed you, my friend." They entered the house, and Nathan said, "Silas, I would like you to meet my young friend, Jotham of Jericho." Then to Jotham he added, Silas and I trained under the same rabbi when we were young. That is, until he left the order to make his wealth as a merchant." "Ah, Nathan," Silas said with a laugh, "you never miss an opportunity to twist the knife of guilt." "Would I inflict guilt on my best of all friends?" Nathan asked innocently. "Well, Silas," he added, "if you had not abandoned your God, I would not have had this fine house to visit. If you had not abandoned your God, I would not have this fine house to visit on my trips to Jericho." Silas smiled a little less. "I did not abandon my God, you know. I only abandoned those who worship him in hypocrisy." Jotham could believe that Nathan had once been so young, but not to Silas. Jotham thought he looked as old as the olive trees he'd camped under, and just as wrinkled. The three of them made their way through the house to the courtyard in the center, and here they met another man. "My friends," Silas said to Nathan and Jotham, "I would like you to meet another friend of mine. This is Hasra of Bethlehem." They greeted each other, then all sat down on the stone benches around the pond made of shiny tiles. Jotham had never seen such a place as this. He didn't much like being inside buildings. He much preferred the open spaces of the grazing meadows. This house had so many colors and places to sit, and trees and bushes, that Jotham thought he could probably stay here for a very long time. The three adults sat around talking for what seemed like forever to Jotham. They talked about the Romans and about Herod and about many things that Jotham didn't understand, but when they started talking about the Messiah, Jotham's ears perked up. "You must be excited," Nathan said to Hasra, "that the Messiah will soon come to Bethlehem." Hasra scoffed. "What would this Messiah be doing in such an insignificant place?" "The scripture is clear," Silas said, and the three men spoke of things that were now becoming familiar to Jotham. It was well past dark when Silas finally lit some oil lamps that hung from the arches. Bored with all the talk, Jotham stood and began to explore. Several alcoves surrounded the room, and in one of those Jotham found a scroll on a pedestal. The alcove was decorated with Hebrew symbols that Jotham didn't understand. Fascinated, he gently touched the surface of the scroll. "It's the Torah," the voice of Silas came from right behind Jotham. Jotham jumped in fright and withdrew his hand quickly. "Do not fear," Silas said gently. "All Jehovah's children should learn to read the Torah." Jotham looked at Silas as if the old man had just announced he could fly. "You see," Silas continued, "I am not such a bad Jew, and not so different from Nathan. I study the Torah every day and say the prayers like any good Jew. It's just that I don't have much passion for some of the forms of religion takers, or rather some of the forms the people give it." Jotham thought about this for a moment, then nodded, almost understanding. Then Silas turned to the rest of the group and announced in a loud voice, "My friends, let me take you for an evening meal." Then, in an inn down the street, the owner is a friend of mine. The other men agreed, and the four walked a short way down the street, which was still busy with people even after dark. They entered another building made of the same reddish plaster as they walked through the door, and into the center of the room. Jotham saw that there were many people eating at wooden tables. Hazra let out a yell to a man at the other side of the room. "Seth," he called out with a huge grin, "I have brought friends to meet your hospitality." The man had a look of panic on his face and motioned something to Hazra, but Hazra paid no attention. "We shall have your finest lamb and your freshest bread," he was saying. Finally Jotham looked behind him to where Seth had been gesturing. And there, sitting at a table by the door, was the Decca of Megiddo.